Let's begin our journey tonight with a question that seems simple, but isn't. Where does Earth end and where does space begin? For most of human history, we didn't really need to know. The sky was simply the sky, unreachable, untouched. A place for birds and dreams and not much else. But in the early 20th century, something changed. We learned to fly, and suddenly a new question emerged. If a plane from one country flies over another country, whose rules apply? Does the sky belong to anyone, or does it belong to everyone? Some legal scholars clung to an ancient principle, a doctrine that stretched back to Roman law. It said that whoever owns the land owns everything above it all the way up to the heavens. It columned to the sky itself. It was a beautiful idea in its simplicity, but it was also impossible to enforce because the heavens are very far away. Let's move forward now to the year 1919. The world had just emerged from the Great War, and with it came new anxieties about what could come from above. Nations realized that airspace wasn't just empty space. It was strategic. It was vulnerable, and so they made a choice. They agreed that each country would have sovereignty over the airspace directly above its territory, not all the way to the heavens, but enough to protect themselves, enough to control who could fly where. This idea was eventually formalized in what became known as the Chicago Convention, a gathering of nations coming together to create rules for the sky, rules about flight paths and safety, and who had the right to say no. But even then, even as they wrote these careful rules about planes and pilots and borders, a few people began to wonder, what happens when we go higher? Because airplanes were just the beginning. There were already whispers of rockets, of spacecraft, of journeys beyond the atmosphere entirely, and some early thinkers began to ask an uncomfortable question. Could the laws we created for airplanes really apply to space? Was flying through space the same as flying through air? The answer was beginning to seem like no. Space was different. It was farther. It was emptier. It didn't belong to any one country. Because it didn't sit above any one country, it sat above all of us, and if that was true, then space needed something new, something we had never created before. It needed its own law. One man saw this more clearly than most.
His name was Vladimir Mandel.
A Czech lawyer, a quiet thinker, someone most people have never heard of. But in 1932, he published a small book, a book that hardly anyone read at the time. In it, he argued something radical. He said that space couldn't just be treated like an extension of air. That space was fundamentally different, and that humanity needed to start thinking about it now, before the rockets launched, before the conflicts began. He called it space law at the time. It seemed absurd. Space travel was science fiction. Rockets barely worked. Why worry about laws for something that didn't exist yet? But Mandel understood something important. He understood that law works best when it arrives early, before the problems, before the fights, before the wars. He was right, but the world wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. Still, the seed had been planted, and in the decades that followed, humanity began to practice, not in space, not yet, but in places that felt similar, places that belonged to no one, places that required cooperation. One of those places was Antarctica. In 1959, 12 nations came together and did something unprecedented. They agreed that Antarctica would belong to no one, that it would be a place of science, of peace, of shared discovery, that no country could claim it, no military could occupy it. It was a fragile agreement, but it worked. And it gave the world a template, a way of thinking about places beyond borders, places that existed for everyone. Around the same time, nations were also working on something else. The law of the sea, rules about who could control the oceans and how far that control extended, rules about international waters, where no single flag held power. These weren't space laws, but they were close. They were rehearsals, practice runs for the kinds of agreements that space would eventually need, and then something magical happened. In 1957 and 1958, the world came together for something called the International Geophysical Year. It was a coordinated effort by scientists from dozens of countries to study the Earth, its weather, its magnetic fields, its mysteries. And as part of that effort, they looked up. They began to see space not as a battlefield, not as territory to claim, but as a place of discovery, a place where nations could work together instead of against each other. It was a brief moment of hope, of possibility, and it set the tone for what was about to come, because in October of 1957, just as the International Geophysical Year was underway, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a small metal sphere beeping its way across the sky. And suddenly space wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real, and the question of who owned it became urgent. Let's rest here for a moment and let these ideas settle. We've traveled from the early days of flight, when we didn't even know where Earth ended. We've seen the first attempts to control the sky, and the first quiet voices suggesting that space might need its own rules. We've watched as humanity practiced cooperation in Antarctica and the oceans, in shared scientific efforts, and now on the edge of the space age, the world faced a choice. Would space become another place to fight over, another territory to divide and conquer? Or could it be something else? Something new. Will continue exploring these questions as we drift deeper into the story. But for now, just breathe and let your mind wander through those early skies, where the rules were just beginning to take shape. October 4th, 1957, a date that changed everything. On that day in the remote steppes of Kazakhstan, a rocket lifted off. Inside its nose cone was something small, something simple, a metal sphere barely 2 feet across, with 4 thin antennas trailing behind it like whiskers. Its name was Sputnik, and as it reached the edge of the atmosphere and its engines fell silent, something extraordinary happened. It didn't fall back down. It kept going higher and higher until it settled into orbit, a perfect arc around the entire Earth, circling the planet every 96 minutes. And as it went, it sang a simple beep, beep, beep that radio operators around the world could hear. The space age had begun, but something else had begun too. Something quieter. Something that would change the very idea of sovereignty itself. Let's think about what Sputnik was doing. As it circled overhead, every orbit took it over dozens of countries. The United States, Europe, Africa, Asia, over cities and farmlands and military bases, over open oceans and frozen poles. It didn't ask permission. It didn't slow down. It didn't stop. It just passed over, and here's what's remarkable. Here's the moment that rewrote everything. No one said no. Not one country filed a protest. Not one government demanded that the Soviet Union bring it down. Not one ambassador stood up at the United Nations and said, "You have violated our airspace." They could have, according to the rules of the time, according to the sovereignty principles nations had fought so hard to establish. Sputnik was trespassing. Every single orbit was an intrusion, but no one said anything. Why? Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps nations didn't know how to respond to something so new. Perhaps they were too busy trying to track it, trying to understand what it meant, to worry about filing complaints. Or perhaps they understood something deeper. Perhaps they understood that Sputnik was too high and too fast for the old rules to make sense anymore. Because if every country claimed sovereignty over the space above them, all the way up, then satellites would be impossible. Every orbit would require permission from dozens of nations, permission that might never come. And if satellites were impossible, then so was everything else. Communication networks, weather monitoring, scientific research, the entire promise of space would die before it even began. And so they stayed quiet, not because they agreed with what the Soviet Union had done, not because they trusted them, but because the alternative was worse. Silence became acceptance, and acceptance became law. This was the moment when an ancient doctrine finally collapsed. Add column to the heavens, the idea that your property extends upward infinitely, forever. It had already been strained by airplanes, but airplanes flew low enough that nations could still claim some kind of control. They could draw lines, set limits, say this high and no higher, but Sputnik was beyond all that. It was in a realm where borders didn't exist, where they couldn't exist, and so the doctrine crumbled, not through debate, not through treaties or votes or formal agreements. It crumbled because a satellite flew overhead, and no one stopped at the heavens. It turned out belonged to no one. What happened next happened quietly, without anyone formally declaring it, without any grand announcement. Space became something new, something the world had rarely seen before, a global commons, not through permission, not through negotiation, but through practice, through the simple fact that satellites kept launching and kept orbiting and no one could stop them. It was law written by reality itself. And once that precedent was set, once that first satellite completed its first orbit, unchallenged, it became almost impossible to reverse. Because if you didn't protest the first satellite, how could you protest the second, or the 10th or the 100th? The moment for objection had passed, and space became free, of course. Governments noticed what had happened, and in the years that followed, they began to talk. Not to reverse what had occurred, but to formalize it, to turn this accidental freedom into something intentional, something written down. The United Nations became the place where these conversations happened. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, resolution after resolution was passed. Carefully worded statements recognizing that space was different, that it served the common interest of all mankind, that it couldn't be carved up like continents, that it required cooperation. These weren't laws, yet not binding treaties, just statements of principle, gentle agreements that nudged the world toward a shared vision. But they mattered because they showed that what Sputnik had forced upon the world was something the world was willing to embrace. Space would not become another battlefield, another place to plant flags and draw borders. It would be something else, something better, at least that was the hope. And so in 1959, the United Nations created something new, a committee with a very long name, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS for short. Its job was simple and enormous: to think about space, to talk about space, to create rules for something humanity had barely begun to explore. It started small, just a few nations, a few experts meeting in conference rooms, debating questions that had no answers yet. What is space? Where does it begin? Who can go there? What can they do when they arrive? These weren't abstract questions. They were urgent, because rockets were getting better, satellites were multiplying, and soon, very soon, humans would follow. The committee worked slowly, carefully, because they understood that the rules they created now would shape everything that came after. They understood that this was their one chance to get it right. And so we arrive at a strange moment in history, a moment where law followed technology. Instead of leading it where a single satellite rewrote the rules of sovereignty, where silence became policy and practice became precedent, Sputnik didn't ask the world for permission, but the world gave it anyway. And in doing so, the world chose a different path. A path where space wouldn't belong to the powerful, but to everyone, where the sky had no borders and the stars were free. It was fragile. It was imperfect, but it was real, and it all started with a metal sphere, the size of a beach ball, beeping its way across the heavens. Let's rest here again and let that sink in. From an ancient doctrine to a satellite that no one stopped, from the collapse of sovereignty to the birth of global cooperation, from silence to acceptance to law, this is how space became what it is today. Not through grand declarations, not through wars or conquest, but through one small object that circled the Earth and changed everything. We'll continue this journey soon, but for now just breathe and imagine that moment. October 4th, 1957, when the beeping started and the world chose not to stop it, and so the world sat down to write, to create something that had never existed before a constitution for space itself. It was the mid-1960s. The space race was accelerating. Both superpowers were launching rockets, faster and faster. The moon was no longer a distant dream. It was a destination, a goal. And everyone understood that if rules didn't come soon, if boundaries weren't drawn, then space would become just another place for conflict. And so they wrote carefully, hopefully with a strange mix of optimism and fear. What they created would become known as the Outer Space Treaty, and it would change everything. The drafting began in those quiet, unconference rooms. Diplomats from dozens of nations, sitting across from each other, the Americans and the Soviets, Cold War adversaries in every other arena. But here in this room they had to agree, because neither side wanted war in space. Neither side wanted weapons orbiting overhead. Neither side wanted the other to claim the moon as their own. And so they found common ground, not because they liked each other, not because they trusted each other, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The work was slow. Every word was debated. Every phrase was scrutinized. Because these weren't just guidelines. These were going to be binding laws, rules that nations would be held to, rules that couldn't easily be undone. They looked backward for inspiration to that frozen continent at the bottom of the world, Antarctica, where nations had already agreed that some places shouldn't be owned, that some places belong to everyone. The Antarctic Treaty had worked. Against all odds it had held. No one had claimed territory. No military bases had been built. Science had flourished. Could the same principle work for space? The diplomats thought yes. Yes, it could. And so they borrowed its language, its structure, its spirit. Space like Antarctica would be a place beyond sovereignty, a place where flags could be planted, but claims could not. This became the heart of the treaty, the foundation on which everything else was built, the non-appropriation principle. It's a simple phrase, but its meaning is profound. It says that no nation can claim space, Not the moon, not Mars, not the asteroids, not the vast emptiness between stars. Outer space, the treaty declared, is not subject to national appropriation, not by claim of sovereignty, not by use or occupation, not by any other means. It belongs to no one, which means it belongs to everyone. It was a radical idea. Throughout human history, the powerful had always claimed what they could reach: new continents, new islands, new resources. But here at the dawn of the space age, the world chose differently. They chose to leave space open, unowned, free, but freedom doesn't mean chaos. The treaty went further. It said that celestial bodies must be used peacefully, that the moon and other worlds were not places for military bases, not places for weapons testing, not places for war. Exploration was allowed, science was encouraged, but conquest was forbidden. It was a beautiful vision, a hope that space could be different, that humanity's expansion into the cosmos wouldn't repeat the violence of its past. Whether that hope would hold remained to be seen. The treaty also banned something specific, something terrifying: weapons of mass destruction in orbit. No nuclear weapons circling the Earth, no missiles in space, no bombs waiting overhead. This wasn't just idealism, this was survival, because both superpowers understood that if weapons went into orbit, the next war would be unwinnable. There would be no warning, no time to respond, just destruction, instant and complete. And so they agreed. Weapons of mass destruction would stay on Earth, where at least there was time to think, time to talk, time to stop. Space would remain clean. The treaty promised something else too, something that sounded simple, but wasn't: free exploration, non-discriminatory access. It meant that every nation had the right to explore space. Not just the powerful, not just the wealthy. Everyone. Space was open. Its study, its use, its benefits were for all of mankind. Of course, the reality was more complicated, because exploration requires money, requires technology, requires infrastructure, and not every nation had those things. But the principle mattered, because it meant that no nation could block another. No one could build a fence around the moon and say, "You cannot enter." The door was open, at least in theory, but the treaty also recognized something practical, something necessary: that while space belonged to everyone, someone still had to be responsible. And so it created a new rule: state responsibility. For all national activities in space, what this meant was simple. If a country launched a satellite, that country was responsible for it. If a company built a rocket, the government that licensed it was responsible. No one could escape into space and claim they were beyond the law. No private company could launch whatever they wanted and hide behind the claim that they weren't a government. The nation was always responsible. It was a practical rule, a rule that made enforcement possible. Because in space, where there are no police, no borders, no courts, the only way to maintain order is to hold nations accountable. And so they did. The treaty also created something new, a system of jurisdiction and control. It worked through registration. Every object launched into space had to be registered with the United Nations, with a record of who owned it, where it went, what it was for, and whoever registered that object kept jurisdiction over it, even in space, even on the moon. So if an American satellite was orbiting Mars, it was still under American law. If a Soviet space station was in orbit around Earth, it was still under Soviet law. This prevented confusion. It prevented conflicts. It made sure that even in the vastness of space, there were still rules, still accountability. Registration became the backbone of space law, and then the treaty did something beautiful. It spoke about astronauts, about the people who would actually go to space. It called them envoys of mankind, not American astronauts, not Soviet cosmonauts, and voice of all humanity, representatives of Earth itself. It was a poetic phrase, a hopeful phrase. It meant that people in space were more than just citizens of their own countries. They carried something bigger, something universal, and because of that, they deserved protection. They deserved help no matter where they landed, no matter whose territory they fell upon. The treaty required that astronauts in distress must be rescued, must be returned safely, that nations must assist each other in bringing them home. Space was dangerous enough. Nations shouldn't make it more dangerous. By refusing to help, this idea grew into something more. A few years later, in 1968, the nations went further. They created the Rescue Agreement. It expanded on what the Outer Space Treaty had started. It detailed exactly what nations were required to do. If astronauts landed in your territory, you had to help them. If their spacecraft fell into your ocean, You had to recover it. It was a safety net, a promise that no matter what went wrong, the world would come together to bring people home. And remarkably, it worked. Over the decades that followed, astronauts have been rescued, spacecraft have been recovered, nations have helped each other. Even in the depths of the Cold War, this agreement held. But rescue wasn't the only concern there, was also liability. What happens when something goes wrong in space? When a satellite crashes, when debris falls to Earth, when one spacecraft collides with another, who pays? Who's responsible? In 1972, the world answered these questions. With the Liability Convention, it said that the nation that launches something into space is liable for the damage it causes. If your satellite falls on someone's house, you pay. If your rocket stage crashes into the ocean, you're responsible. It made space launches accountable. It meant that nations couldn't just throw objects into orbit and walk away. They had to take responsibility for what went up and what came down. And finally, the registration system was formalized. The Registration Convention in 1976 turned the earlier principles into detailed requirements. Every launch had to be recorded. Every object had to be tracked. A registry maintained by the United Nations would keep a record of everything humanity had sent into space. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was essential because space was already getting crowded, and without a way to track what was up there, without a way to know who owned what, chaos would follow. The registry was order, it was memory, it was proof that even as humanity spread into the cosmos, we were still keeping track,
Still taking responsibility.
still trying to do this right. And so by the mid-1970s, the foundation was complete. 5 treaties, dozens of principles, hundreds of carefully chosen words. Together, they formed something that had never existed before, a legal framework for the infinite. It was optimistic, almost naively so. It assumed that nations would cooperate, that peaceful exploration was possible, that humanity could venture into space without bringing our worst instincts with us. It assumed that we could be better, and for a while those assumptions seemed correct. The treaties were signed, the rules were followed, space remained mostly peaceful, but the framers couldn't see what was coming, couldn't imagine a future where space wasn't just for governments, where companies would launch rockets, where tourists would orbit Earth, where mining asteroids wasn't science fiction. They wrote laws for a simple age, an age of flags and footprints. They couldn't know how complicated space would become, but what they built still stands, still matters. Because even now, even as space grows more crowded and more commercial and more complex, these treaties remain the foundation, the constitution of space itself. Let's pause here and rest in this moment, a moment of hope, of possibility, of the belief that humanity could write rules and follow them, that space could be different, that we could reach for the stars with open hands instead of clenched fists. It was a beautiful dream, and in many ways it came true. But dreams are fragile things, and the universe is vast and strange, and full of challenges that no treaty could anticipate. We'll explore what came next, but for now just breathe and feel. Grateful for those diplomats in those quiet rooms who tried their best to make space a place of peace. But the dream didn't last forever, because while diplomats were writing treaties, strategists were studying maps. Not maps of Earth, but maps of space itself. And they were beginning to see something the treaties had tried to ignore, that space wasn't just a place for science. It wasn't just a realm of cooperation and peace. It was also power. And power changes everything. A new field of study emerged, quietly at first, in military academies and defense think tanks, in classified briefings and strategic journals. It had a name: astropolitics, the politics of space itself. It borrowed from an older idea, geopolitics, the study of how geography shapes power, how mountains create borders, how rivers define territories, how whoever controls the seas controls trade. Astropolitics asked, what if we applied those same questions to space? What if space has its own geography, its own strategic terrain, its own choke points and high grounds? What if the location of satellites matters just as much as the location of ports? The answer was becoming clear. Space wasn't neutral, it never had been, and those who controlled it would shape the future. Let's think about orbits for a moment. They seem empty, just pass through nothing. Mathematical curves that satellites trace as they fall forever around the Earth. But orbits are not all equal. Some orbits are more valuable than others. Some offer views of the entire planet. Some allow constant communication. Some provide early warning of missile launches. Low Earth orbit, where most satellites fly, is crowded and fast-moving. Good for imaging, good for surveillance. But you need many satellites to maintain constant coverage. Geostationary orbit, far higher, moving at exactly the same speed as Earth's rotation, allows a satellite to hover over one spot forever, watching, listening, relaying signals. There are only so many spots in geostationary orbit, only so many slots where satellites can sit. Without interfering with each other, those slots are strategic terrain, as valuable as any harbor, as contested as any strait. Orbits, it turns out, are geography, just geography that most people can't see. And then there are the Lagrange points, strange places where the gravity of two bodies, Earth and Moon or Earth and Sun, perfectly balanced, where objects can sit almost motionless, without fuel, without effort. There are 5 of them. 5 points where the forces cancel out, where space stations could float, where telescopes could observe, where weapons could wait. Some are stable, some are not, but all of them are strategic, because whoever sits at a Lagrange point sits at a crossroads between Earth and Moon. Between orbits and deep space, they're the high ground of the solar system. And in war, the high ground always matters. This is the uncomfortable truth that astropolitics revealed. That space is the ultimate high ground, higher than any mountain, higher than any aircraft, a place from which you can see everything below. Throughout history, armies have fought for hilltops, for ridges, for any position that offers a view and an advantage. Space offers both, permanently. A satellite can watch entire continents, can track troop movements, can intercept communications, can guide weapons with perfect precision, and there's almost nothing the people on the ground can do about it. Space superiority means information superiority, means navigation superiority, means targeting superiority. It means winning before the battle even begins. And so quietly, inevitably, space became a military domain. Not because anyone wanted it to, but because it couldn't be anything else. Now let's make a distinction, an important one. Militarization and weaponization. They sound similar, but they're not the same. Militarization means using space for military purposes. Reconnaissance satellites, communication networks, navigation systems, early warning sensors. These things don't attack, they don't destroy. They observe, they assist, they inform, and technically they're allowed. The Outer Space Treaty never banned military uses of space, only weapons of mass destruction, only aggressive acts on celestial bodies. Everything else was left undefined. Weaponization is different. That means putting weapons in space, satellites that can attack systems designed to destroy. And here's where it gets complicated, because the treaty has gaps. The Outer Space Treaty banned nuclear weapons in orbit, banned weapons of mass destruction, but it said nothing about conventional weapons, nothing about lasers, nothing about kinetic projectiles, nothing about systems designed to disable. Rather than destroy, it was an oversight. Or perhaps it was intentional ambiguity, because in the 1960s, such weapons seemed impossible, seemed distant. They don't seem distant anymore, and so the question remains open. Is it legal to put conventional weapons in space? Different nations have different answers, and the treaty offers no clarity. It's a gap, a dangerous one. And as technology advances, that gap grows wider. One capability has already emerged, quietly but undeniably: anti-satellite weapon systems, designed to destroy or disable satellites, to blind an enemy's eyes in space, to cut their communications, to remove their advantage. Some use missiles launched from Earth or air, reaching up to intercept satellites in orbit. Others use lasers, beams of concentrated light that can dazzle sensors or burn through solar panels. Still others use kinetic kill vehicles, satellites that can maneuver close to other satellites and simply collide with them. And some are more subtle, jamming signals, hacking systems, interfering with operations without physical contact. Many nations now have or are developing anti-satellite capabilities. The United States, Russia, China, India, others, because in modern warfare, satellites are essential, and anything essential becomes a target. This creates a problem, a dangerous one: deterrence. For decades, nuclear deterrence kept the peace, mutually assured destruction, the knowledge that if you strike first, you'll be struck back just as hard. It was terrifying, but it worked, because the consequences were clear. In space, the consequences are murkier. If one nation destroys another satellite, is that an act of war? Does it justify retaliation? And if so, what kind? Do you destroy their satellite? Do you strike back on Earth? Do you escalate? No one knows, there are no rules, no clear lines, and that uncertainty is destabilizing. Because in a crisis when tensions are high and decisions must be made quickly, uncertainty can lead to mistakes, and mistakes in space could spiral into conflict. Faster than anyone intends. Crisis stability depends on clarity, on knowing what will happen if you cross a line. In space, those lines are blurred, and that makes everyone more nervous. And so, space has become what it was always going to become, a distinct military domain, just like land, like sea, like air, like cyberspace, a place where nations compete, where they position assets, where they prepare for conflicts they hope will never come. It's officially recognized now by the United States, by NATO, by others. Space is a warfighting domain, not because anyone wanted war in space, but because space is too important to ignore, too valuable to leave undefended. And so the military planners map it, study it, train for it just in case. This is where the story shifts, where the optimism of the treaty era meets the realism of strategic competition, where the vision of space as a peaceful commons confronts the reality that space is also a battlefield. It hasn't erupted into open conflict, not yet. Perhaps it never will, but the potential is there, growing with every new satellite, every new capability, every new nation entering the space domain. Astropolitics is no longer theoretical. It's real, it's present. It's shaping decisions in capitals around the world, and the treaties written in a simpler time offer no answers. Let's pause here in this tension, this uncertainty. We've moved from hope to strategy, from cooperation to competition, from the dream that space could be different, to the recognition that space reflects who we are, and who we are is complicated, hopeful and fearful, peaceful and prepared. We want space to be a place of wonder, but we also know it's a place of power, and power always brings conflict. Rest here, breathe, let these uncomfortable truths settle, because this is the world we live in now, where satellites orbit overhead, and no one is quite sure what happens next. We'll continue soon, but for now, just sit with this reality. Space is no longer just a dream. It's a domain, a battlefield, a frontier, and the rules are still being written. And then everything changed again, not through treaties this time, not through governments or diplomats, or careful negotiations, through companies, private companies with rockets of their own, with ambitions of their own, with money and vision, and impatience with the old way of doing things. They looked at space and saw something different from what the treaties imagined. Not a commons to be protected, not a realm of peaceful cooperation, but an opportunity, a market, a frontier waiting to be opened, and the law written for governments didn't know what to do with them. It started slowly in the 1980s and 90s, with telecommunications companies launching satellites, with launch services offering to carry payloads for a fee, but it accelerated dramatically. By the 2000s, private companies weren't just participating in space, they were leading it. Space at Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic Rocket Lab, Planet Labs, hundreds of others. Some wanted to launch cheaper rockets. Some wanted to image the Earth. Some wanted to carry tourists. Some wanted to mine asteroids. All of them wanted to make money, and none of them fit neatly into the legal framework that existed, because the Outer Space Treaty was written for nations. It talked about states, about governments, about national activities. It never imagined that companies would be the ones building the rockets, flying the missions, making the decisions, and so the law had to adapt quickly, imperfectly, country by country. The solution was licensing. If companies wanted to launch, they needed permission, not from the UN, not from some global authority, but from their own government. National licensing systems became the bridge between the old treaty framework and the new commercial reality. Each country created its own rules, its own process, its own requirements. Want to launch a rocket? You need a license. Want to operate a satellite? You need authorization. Want to bring something back from space? You need approval. The government became the gatekeeper, and through that gate, private companies could enter space. It was practical, but it was also inconsistent, because different countries had different standards, different regulations, different levels of oversight. Space law, which was supposed to be universal, became fragmented. The United States led the way, and also made it complicated, because in America, space is split. NASA handles civilian activities. The Department of Defense handles military ones. The FAA licenses launches. The FCC regulates communications. NOAA oversees imaging. It's a dual structure, civilian and military, side by side. sometimes working together, sometimes competing, and private companies have to navigate both. They have to convince NASA that their plans are safe. They have to assure the military that they're not a threat. They have to satisfy regulators that they're following the rules. It's bureaucratic. It's slow, but it's also how America maintains control, how it ensures that even as companies reach for space, the government keeps oversight, state responsibility enforced through paperwork. But licensing wasn't enough. Not for what companies wanted to do, because companies didn't just want to launch satellites, they wanted to build industries, create markets, extract value. They wanted to commercialize space, and so new laws were written. Commercialization statutes, rules, specifically designed to encourage business in space, to protect investments, to clarify property rights. The U.S. Commercial Space Launch Act, the Space Act Amendments. Other nations followed with their own versions. These laws said that if you invest in space, you can profit from it, that if you retrieve resources, you can own them, that if you build something in orbit, it's yours. They tried to balance the treaty's prohibition on owning territory with the business reality that companies need ownership of something. It was a delicate balance, and not everyone agreed it was the right one. The most controversial part came in 2015, when the United States passed a law that said explicitly that American companies could own resources extracted from space, water from asteroids, metals from the moon, helium-3 from the regolith. If you mined it, it's yours. Other nations followed. Luxembourg, Japan, the UAE, each passing their own versions. They called it space resource utilization, and they argued it was perfectly legal because the Outer Space Treaty said you couldn't own territory, couldn't claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, but it said nothing about resources. Nothing about what you could take, what you could process, what you could sell, and so they drew a distinction, a legal one, perhaps a shaky one. Territory is different from resources. You can't own the moon, but you can own what you dig out of it. It's a fine line, a very fine line. Think about it this way: if you can't own the territory, but you can own everything valuable on it, what's the difference? If a company plants a mining operation on an asteroid and extracts all its metals, have they appropriated it or just used it? The law says it depends. Small-scale extraction for life support, for fuel for immediate use. That's called ISRU, into resource utilization, and everyone agrees that's allowed, even necessary, because you can't carry everything from Earth. But large-scale mining for profit, for export back to Earth, that's different. That's commercial extraction. And there the law is murky, contested, unresolved. Some say it's legal. Some say it violates the spirit of the treaty. Some say we need new rules entirely. The debate continues. There was an attempt to clarify this decades ago. In 1979, the UN drafted something called the Moon Agreement. It tried to address exactly this question. It said that the moon and its resources are the common heritage of mankind, that they should benefit everyone, that exploitation should be international and equitable. It was idealistic, it was ambitious, and it failed. Almost no one signed it. The United States didn't, Russia didn't, China didn't. None of the major spacefaring nations wanted to commit, because common heritage sounded like shared ownership, like international control, like no one could act without everyone agreeing, and no nation, especially no nation with the capability to reach the moon, wanted to give up that much control. And so the Moon Agreement sits in the archives, signed by a handful of countries, ignored by the rest, a reminder of what might have been, but wasn't, and now we're seeing the consequences of that failure, of the legal ambiguity that remains. In 2023, a Japanese company called iSpace attempted to land on the moon, to collect regolith, to test resource extraction. The lander crashed, the mission failed, but the attempt was significant because it was private, commercial, profit-driven. It wasn't a government mission. It was a company trying to prove that lunar resources could be collected, could be owned, could be sold. If they had succeeded, it would have been a test case, a real-world example of whether space resource laws hold up. The crash delayed that test, but it didn't stop it. Other companies are coming. Other missions are planned. The question will be answered soon, whether we're ready or not. And so the debate continues, quietly in academic journals, loudly in international forums. Use versus ownership. Can you use space resources without owning the place they come from? Can you extract value from a commons and keep it all for yourself? Some say yes, that use is not appropriation, that taking what you need is not the same as claiming what you don't. Others say no. That large-scale extraction is appropriation, in all but name. That it violates the treaty spirit, even if not its letter. And still others say the treaty is outdated. That it was written for a different era. That we need new rules for a commercial age. New rules that balance the freedom to explore and profit with the principle that space belongs to all. Rules that haven't been written yet. This is where we are now, in the gap between old law and new reality, where companies are moving faster than treaties can be negotiated, where technology is advancing faster than regulations can adapt, where space is no longer just a place of flags and footprints, but of business plans and profit margins. The model has broken the neat division between governments and governance, between exploration and exploitation, between the commons and commerce. Private companies have entered a system designed for states, and they're changing it. Whether the law catches up remains to be seen. But one thing is clear, space is no longer just political. It's no longer just strategic. It's economic, and economics has a way of rewriting everything else. Let's rest here in this transformation, from cooperation to competition, from governments to companies, from exploration to economy. The treaties still exist, the principles still matter, but they're being tested in ways their authors never imagined. Space is becoming something new, something we're still figuring out, a marketplace, a frontier, a contested terrain where the rules are being written, not in conference rooms but in boardrooms, by people who see opportunity where others see common heritage, by people who ask not what space can teach us, but what space can give us. It's not wrong, it's not right, it's just different. And the law is struggling to keep up. Breathe and let that settle. Because this is the world we're entering, where the old rules meet the new ambitions, and no one knows exactly what happens next. There's something orbiting above us right now. Something we don't like to talk about. Not satellites, not spacecraft, not anything useful. Debris, millions of pieces, fragments of metal and plastic and paint, shards of destroyed satellites, remnants of explosions, flakes of rocket fuel frozen solid in the void. All of it, traveling at 17,000 miles per hour, fast enough that even the smallest piece becomes a weapon. We filled orbit with shrapnel and called it progress, and now we don't know how to clean it up. It happened gradually, then suddenly. In the beginning, there were just a few satellites, a few rocket stages left behind, objects large enough to track, to catalog, to avoid. But with each launch came more debris, and with each collision came exponentially more, because when two objects collide in space, they don't just break, they shatter into hundreds, thousands of smaller pieces. Each piece becomes a new projectile, a new threat, capable of causing another collision, which creates more debris, which causes more collisions. It's called the Kessler syndrome, a cascade, a chain reaction, where debris creates more debris until entire orbital zones become unusable. We're not there yet, but we're getting closer. Orbit is becoming congested, dangerously so, and the law has no answer. Here's the problem, a legal problem that sounds small, but isn't. The Liability Convention holds nations responsible for damage caused by their space objects. If a satellite crashes into your spacecraft, the nation that launched it must pay, but that only works for objects you can identify. For debris, you can track 4 pieces, large enough to know where they came from. Most debris isn't large, it's tiny, smaller than a marble, smaller than a bolt, impossible to track, impossible to attribute, and if you can't prove where it came from, you can't hold anyone liable. So when a fleck of paint punctures a solar panel, when a fragment of metal damages a sensor, when debris too small to see causes millions in damage, no one pays. No one is responsible. The gaps in the law are the same size as the debris, which is to say everywhere. And here's something stranger, something that makes the problem worse. Ownership in space lasts forever. Under current law, you never lose ownership of something you launch, even if it stops working. Even if it's been abandoned for decades, even if it's breaking apart into dangerous fragments, it's still yours. A dead satellite from the 1970s still belongs to whoever launched it. A rocket stage tumbling through orbit is still their property, and property rights matter because they mean no one else can touch it, not without permission. This is where it gets absurd in a slow, nightmarish way. Imagine you want to clean up space. You build a spacecraft designed to capture debris, to remove it, to bring it down safely. Noble goal, necessary goal. But legally you can't just grab things. Because that debris still belongs to someone, and touching someone's property without their consent could be considered interference, theft, even an act of aggression. So you have to ask permission from every nation for every piece of debris, even though that debris is dangerous, even though it threatens everyone, even though the owner has abandoned it, has no intention of retrieving it, has no ability to remove it. You still need their consent. And if they say no, or if they don't respond, or if you can't even figure out who owns it, then it stays tumbling, threatening forever. The treaties never anticipated this. They assumed that nations would be responsible, that they would manage their objects, that they would clean up after themselves, but there's no binding duty to do so. No law that says if you launch something, you must eventually remove it. No requirement to deorbit satellites when they die. No obligation to retrieve what you've left behind. There are guidelines, recommendations, best practices. The UN has debris mitigation guidelines. They suggest that satellites should be removed within 25 years, that rocket stages should be deorbited, that explosions should be avoided. But these are soft law, voluntary, non-binding, which means they're ignored, often because compliance is expensive, and there's no penalty for not complying. So debris accumulates slowly, steadily, and the problem grows worse. Some have proposed a different approach, an economic one: the polluter pays. If you create debris, you should pay for it. Pay for the risk it creates. Pay for the cleanup, pay for the damage. It's a simple principle, used on Earth for environmental regulation, for toxic waste, for pollution. Why not in space? The idea is appealing, but the implementation is nearly impossible. Because how do you measure the cost of debris? How do you calculate the risk of a single fragment? How do you enforce payment across borders, across decades? And what if the nation that created the debris no longer exists? What if the company that launched the satellite has gone bankrupt? Who pays? Then the polluter pays principle sounds fair, but in space fairness is hard to enforce. Another proposal is simpler, more radical. Just declare it abandoned. If a satellite has been dead for long enough, if no one has tried to control it, if it's clearly been abandoned, then it's no longer property, it's no longer protected, and anyone can remove it. Abandoned property laws exist on Earth. If you leave something on the street, if you walk away from a building, if you relinquish control, eventually it's no longer yours. Why not apply the same principle to space? It's logical, but it's also dangerous. Because who decides what counts as abandoned? What if a nation claims they still intend to retrieve it? What if a company says they're planning to repair it? And what if in the chaos of removal, someone claims their active satellite was mistakenly labeled as debris? Abandoned property proposals open as many questions as they answer. Some lawyers have suggested an even stranger approach: market share liability. It works like this: if debris causes damage, but you can't identify the specific piece that caused it, then all contributors pay proportionally, based on how much debris they've added to orbit. If your nation has launched 20% of the satellites, you pay 20% of the damages, even if your debris didn't cause the specific collision. It's collective responsibility, shared liability insurance by another name. It's used in some legal systems on Earth for products that cause harm. When you can't identify the specific manufacturer, but applying it to space would require international agreement, a treaty, an enforcement mechanism, none of which currently exist, and so it remains a proposal, an idea, a solution still waiting for adoption. And here's the cruelest irony, the final twist in this nightmare. Even if you try to clean up debris, even if you succeed in removing it, you might face legal consequences, because cleanup missions are risky, dangerous, complex. What if your cleanup spacecraft accidentally collides with something? What if it creates more debris while trying to remove debris? What if it damages an active satellite in the process? Then you're liable under the existing treaties for the damage your cleanup mission caused. So the very act of trying to solve the problem exposes you to legal risk. It's a perverse incentive, one that discourages action, that rewards an action that keeps debris exactly where it is. This is why debris is a governance nightmare. It's not just a technical problem, not just an engineering challenge. It's a legal tangle that no one knows how to unravel, ownership that never expires, consent requirements that can't be met, no duty to clean, no way to enforce responsibility, voluntary guidelines that aren't followed, and cleanup efforts that carry their own legal risks. Every attempt at a solution runs into a wall built from the very treaties meant to protect space, And so the debris accumulates, orbit grows more dangerous, and the international community talks and proposes and debates, but doesn't act. Because action requires changing the law, and changing the law requires agreement. And agreement in space law is nearly impossible. Let's pause here and feel the weight of this reality. We reached for the stars. We've built industries in orbit. We've connected the world through satellites. But we've also left behind a mess, a dangerous, growing, unmanageable mess. And the laws we wrote to govern space are inadequate to the task of cleaning it. They protect property, but not safety. They assign liability, but only when attribution is possible. They encourage exploration, but not stewardship. We've treated space like an infinite resource, like a place we could use without consequence. But space isn't infinite, orbit is finite, and we're learning that every action has a consequence, even in the void. This is the reality of modern space law. Not the optimistic vision of peaceful cooperation, not the strategic calculations of military planners, not the economic ambitions of commercial ventures, but the mundane, grinding reality of a legal system that can't keep up, that can't adapt fast enough, that can't solve problems it was never designed to address. We filled orbit with shrapnel and called it progress, and now we live with what we've created. Breathe and let that settle, the weight of it, the frustration of it, the danger of it. Because this is what happens when law lags behind technology, when cooperation fails, when everyone's responsibility becomes no one's responsibility. We'll move forward soon, but for now, just sit with this uncomfortable truth. Space is filling with debris, and we don't know how to stop it. So we have a problem. A growing problem, debris congestion, collisions waiting to happen, and naturally someone asks the obvious question, who's in charge? Who manages traffic in space? The answer is complicated and unsatisfying, because in space no one is really in charge. Not the way you'd hope. There are rules. There are systems, there are attempts at coordination, but enforcement authority, a clear chain of command, those mostly don't exist. The concept has a name, space traffic management. It sounds simple, like air traffic control, but for orbit, a system where someone watches all the satellites, all the debris, all the objects moving through space, and coordinates them, directs them, prevents collisions. It's a necessary idea, an urgent idea, because space is crowded now. Thousands of active satellites, tens of thousands of pieces of trackable debris, millions of smaller fragments, all moving at incredible speeds in overlapping orbits, with no traffic lights, no lands, no rules of the road. It's chaos. Organized chaos, barely. And space traffic management is the dream of making it less chaotic, but it's still mostly a dream. What does exist is collision avoidance. Organizations like the US Space Force track objects, calculate trajectories, predict when things might collide, and when they do, they send warnings, alerts to satellite operators, notifications that say you might want to move. It's voluntary, it's cooperative, it's surprisingly effective. Most operators listen, most satellites maneuver, most collisions are avoided, but it's not a system. It's not coordinated. It's not governed. It's just people trying their best, sharing information, hoping others do the same. And hoping is not a legal framework. In 2018, the United States tried to formalize this with something called Space Policy Directive 3. It laid out a vision, a plan for space traffic management, for better coordination, for shared data, for clear responsibilities. It said the Department of Commerce would become the clearinghouse, the central hub for tracking objects, for providing data to operators, for managing traffic. It was ambitious, well-intentioned, but implementation has been slow, underfunded, incomplete, because building a global traffic management system requires cooperation, requires other nations to share data, to agree on standards, to trust each other. And trust in space is in short supply. So Space Policy Directive 3 remains partly aspirational, a goal more than a reality. What we do have is awareness, space situational awareness, the ability to know what's up there, where it is, where it's going. It's the foundation of everything. You can't manage traffic if you don't know where the traffic is. The US military tracks around 27,000 objects, anything larger than a softball, using radar, using telescopes, using sensors scattered around the globe. It's impressive, but it's incomplete. Because most debris is smaller than a softball, invisible to current tracking systems, but still dangerous. And other nations have their own tracking systems, their own data which they don't always share, so the picture is fragmented, incomplete. full of gaps. We see some of what's up there, but not all, not nearly all. Recently, there's been progress, a new system. TraceS's Traffic Coordination System for Space. It's designed to be the next generation. Better tracking, better data sharing, better coordination. Run by the Department of Commerce, open to international partners. Meant to provide a common operational picture. It's still being built, still being tested, but it represents a step forward, a move toward actual traffic management, actual coordination. But even when it's complete, it will have limits, because it can only work if nations participate, if they share their data, if they follow the alerts, and participation cannot be forced. This is the fundamental problem, the structural weakness, at the heart of space governance. Enforcement happens at the national level, or it doesn't happen at all. There's no global authority, no space police, no way to make nations or companies comply. The only enforcement mechanism is national regulation. If a country licenses a satellite, that country can regulate it, can impose requirements, can revoke permission, but only for their own satellites, only for their own companies. They can't regulate what other nations do, can't enforce rules on foreign operators, and so compliance depends on each nation, enforcing their own rules, holding their own actors accountable. Some do this well, some don't. In the United States, enforcement is particularly messy because oversight is divided, split between 3 different agencies. The FAA regulates launches, the FCC regulates communications, NOAA regulates remote sensing. 3 agencies, 3 sets of rules, 3 approval processes. If you want to launch a satellite that communicates and images the Earth, you need permission from all 3, and they don't always coordinate, don't always agree, don't always move at the same speed. It's called the trifurcated oversight problem, and it makes compliance complicated, expensive, frustrating. Companies complain, lawyers grumble, reform is proposed but progress is slow, because bureaucracy is hard to change, and no one wants to give up authority, so the system stays fragmented. What does provide some accountability is registration. The Registration Convention requires that every object launched into space be registered with the UNAM, with details about its orbit, its purpose, its owner. It's not perfect. Some nations don't register promptly. Some objects slip through. Some details are vague, but registration creates a paper trail, a record of who launched what. And that record matters because if something goes wrong, if a satellite causes damage, if there's a dispute, registration determines jurisdiction. Whoever registered the object retains control and responsibility. It's indirect accountability, not as strong as enforcement, but better than nothing. Registration is the thread that ties objects in space back to the nations that launch them, and threads can pull in both directions. When disputes do arise, there are mechanisms. Theoretically, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, the UN's principal judicial body. Nations can bring cases there, can argue about treaty violations, about liability, about rights, but the ICJ only works if both nations agree to participate, agree to accept its jurisdiction, agree to follow its ruling, and many nations don't agree. So most space disputes never reach the ICJ. They're settled diplomatically or not settled at all. The court exists, but its power is limited by consent, by politics, by the reluctance of nations to submit to outside judgment. It's a mechanism, but not a solution. For private actors, for companies, there's arbitration. When 2 companies have a dispute about a collision, about interference, about contract terms, they can go to arbitration. Private tribunals, neutral experts, binding decisions. It's faster than courts, more flexible, more specialized, and it's growing. As commercial space grows, arbitration grows with it. But it only works between willing parties, between companies that agree to arbitrate. It can't resolve disputes between a company and a government, can't handle criminal violations, can't address systemic problems. It's a tool, a useful one, but limited in scope. And this brings us back to the central truth. There is no global space police, no authority that can patrol orbit, no agency that can arrest violators, no force that can intervene when rules are broken. Space law relies entirely on voluntary compliance, on nations choosing to follow treaties, on companies choosing to follow regulations. And when they don't, when rules are ignored, when bad actors operate, the only recourse is diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, reputation damage. Soft power, not hard enforcement. It works to a degree. Most nations follow most rules most of the time, but it's fragile, dependent on good faith, vulnerable to defection. One bad actor can cause enormous problems, and there's very little anyone can do about it. This is the reality of space governance, not the system we'd design if we were starting from scratch, but the system we have built, piecemeal across decades, by nations that didn't always trust each other. Rules exist, guidelines exist, coordination exists, but enforcement mostly doesn't. And so space traffic management remains aspirational, collision avoidance remains voluntary, registration remains incomplete. And when problems arise, we hope, we coordinate, we negotiate, but we can't compel, can't force, can't truly enforce. Let's pause here in this uncomfortable reality. We've built an incredible presence in space, thousands of satellites, essential infrastructure, critical services, but we've built it on a legal foundation that's full of cracks. No central authority, no enforcement mechanism, no way to make everyone play by the same rules. It's worked so far, mostly because most actors want it to work, but a space gets more crowded as more nations enter. As commercial interests grow, the weakness becomes more apparent, the gaps become more dangerous. We have rules, but rules without enforcement are just suggestions, and in space suggestions aren't enough. Breathe and let that settle, because this is what governance looks like. When there's no government, when coordination is voluntary, when compliance is optional, it's not that there's no system, it's that the system depends entirely on everyone choosing to cooperate. And that's a fragile thing to depend on. We'll continue soon, but for now, just rest in this truth. Space has laws, but space has no police, and that makes all the difference. But let's step back now, away from debris and traffic and governance structures, and remember something fundamental, that space isn't just about satellites, isn't just about treaties and corporations and strategic assets. It's also about people, real people, human beings who go to space, who are affected by space, who have rights that don't disappear just because they've left the ground. People don't stop being human in orbit, and that simple truth creates a whole new set of questions the treaties barely addressed. Think about astronauts, cosmonauts. Take notes. People living in space, on the International Space Station, on future lunar bases, on missions to Mars. What's their legal status? What laws apply? The answer depends on where they're standing or floating. On a spacecraft, they're under the jurisdiction of the nation that registered it. American astronauts on an American module follow American law. Russian cosmonauts on a Russian module follow Russian law. Simple enough in theory, but what about shared modules? What about international missions? What about private spacecraft carrying people from multiple nations? Then it gets complicated. The ISS has an elaborate agreement, defining jurisdictions, assigning command authority, clarifying which laws apply to whom and when. It works because everyone agreed in advance, because the nations involved wanted it to work. But for future missions, for commercial stations, for settlements on the moon, those agreements don't exist yet, and creating them will be just as complicated because people in space still have rights, still need protection, still require law, even hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth. And then there's surveillance, satellites watching from above. They can see so much: military bases, infrastructure, borders, cities. They can track movements, monitor activities, observe things that nations might prefer stayed hidden. This raises questions, uncomfortable questions, about human rights, about privacy, because surveillance from space doesn't require a warrant, doesn't need permission, can't easily be stopped. If a satellite passes over your country, over your home, it can look, it can record, it can collect data, and there's very little you can do about it. Some nations argue this is a violation. That constant observation from above infringes on sovereignty, on privacy, on the right to be left alone. Others argue that space is free, that observation is not interference, that looking is not the same as touching, the law is unsettled. The Outer Space Treaty allows observation, but it doesn't address the human rights implications, and so satellites keep watching, keep recording, keep collecting, and people below have no choice but to be seen. Privacy becomes even more complicated. With remote sensing, commercial satellites now, not just military ones, companies that sell images to anyone willing to pay, high-resolution images, detailed enough to identify vehicles, to track construction, to monitor compliance with environmental laws. It's useful, incredibly useful, for science, for journalism, for accountability, because those images can reveal private property, personal activities, things that were once behind fences, behind walls, hidden from view. And once an image is taken, It can be sold, shared, published. Without the consent of the people being observed, there are some restrictions. Some nations require that imaging companies obscure certain sites, that they don't sell data to adversaries, that they respect some boundaries. But these are national regulations, not universal rules, and they vary widely. Privacy from above is not a settled question, and as resolution improves, as satellites multiply, the question becomes more urgent. Where is the line between observation and intrusion? Between transparency and surveillance? No one knows yet, but everyone is being watched now. Imagine going further, to the moon, to Mars, to stations in deep space, and ask what rights do people have there? The question sounds abstract, but it's not, because people will live in those places 4 months, 4 years, perhaps permanently, and they'll still be human. They'll still need protection, freedom, dignity. This is where interplanetary human rights law becomes necessary. Can a government restrict speech on a lunar base? Can a corporation control workers' movements on Mars? Can authorities detain someone indefinitely on a space station? On Earth, we have protections, constitutions, international human rights treaties, courts that can intervene, but in space, on other worlds, those protections might not apply, or might apply differently, or might not exist at all. Some scholars argue that human rights are universal, that they extend everywhere humans go. That location doesn't change their validity. Others argue that space environments are different, that survival requires control, that freedoms might need to be limited. It's a debate that's just beginning, but it's critical, because the rules we set now will shape life in space for generations. And if we don't protect rights from the beginning, we might never get them back. There's another question too, about access, about who gets to go. Space is not accessible to everyone. Far from it, it requires perfect health, rigorous training, the ability to withstand extreme physical stress, and that means many people are excluded automatically. People with disabilities, people with chronic conditions, people whose bodies don't fit the narrow profile of an astronaut. This raises questions about equity, about discrimination, about whether space should be reserved only for the physically perfect. Some argue it's necessary, that space is too dangerous, too demanding, that accessibility would compromise safety. Others argue that exclusion is unjust, that technology can accommodate that. We've made assumptions about who belongs in space based on outdated models. As commercial spaceflight expands, this question becomes more pressing. Should there be a right to go to space? Or is it a privilege reserved for the few? Disability and access are not often discussed in space law, but they should be, because space belongs to all humanity. Or so the treaties say, and if that's true, then humanity in all its diversity should be able to go there, which brings us to a deeper critique, one that challenges the very foundation of space law. The critique is about equity, about who wrote the rules and who benefits, because space law was written by a handful of nations, wealthy nations, spacefaring nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, a few European countries. Everyone else had little say, little input, little influence, and the law they created reflects that. It protects the interests of those who can reach space, those who can launch satellites, those who can extract resources. It talks about freedom of access, but access requires money, technology, infrastructure. It talks about common heritage, but it allows those who arrive first to take what they find. It's a law designed by the powerful for the powerful, and developing nations have noticed and objected. They argue that space law perpetuates inequality, that it gives advantages to those who already have advantages, that it locks in a hierarchy where wealthy nations explore, extract profit, and everyone else watches from below. This isn't just philosophical, it's practical, because space benefits are not evenly distributed. GPS weather satellites, communication networks, remote sensing. These technologies change lives, save lives, but they're controlled by a few nations, a few companies, and access comes at a price. Developing nations depend on space technology, but they don't control it, don't own it, can't shape how it's used. They're consumers, not creators, beneficiaries but not equals. And space law doesn't address this, doesn't require technology sharing, doesn't mandate equitable access. It assumes that the market will distribute benefits, that private companies will serve everyone, that progress will trickle down, but markets don't distribute evenly, and trickle down rarely reaches everyone. So the critique stands. Space law created with noble intentions has embedded inequalities, has excluded voices, as concentrated power and a space becomes more commercial, more valuable, more central to daily life, those inequalities will only grow. This is the moral turn, the moment we remember that law is not neutral, that rules reflect values, that who writes the law shapes who benefits from it. Space law imagined itself as universal, as serving all humanity, as creating a framework for peaceful cooperation. And in some ways it succeeded. Wars have been avoided, coordination has happened. Space has remained mostly open, but in other ways it failed. It excluded people, it ignored inequalities. It assumed that everyone would have the same opportunities, and people don't stop being human in orbit, but they also don't stop being human. When they're stuck on the ground, when they're denied access, when they're governed by rules they never agreed to. Let's rest here in this uncomfortable space. Between aspiration and reality, space law tried to be universal, tried to serve humanity, tried to create justice. But justice is hard, especially when power is unequal, when opportunities are limited, when voices are excluded. Astronauts need rights, privacy needs protection, disabilities need accommodation, developing nations need inclusion. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities, because space is for all of us, or it's supposed to be. And if we're going to make that true, if we're going to create a future in space that reflects our best values, not our worst inequalities, then we need to start listening to people who've been excluded, to voices that weren't heard, to concerns that weren't considered, because space law is still being written, still evolving, still open to change. And this time, everyone deserves a seat at the table. Breathe and let that settle, the hope of it, the necessity of it, the difficulty of it. Because humanity comes with rights and responsibilities, and the need to be better, even in space. Especially in space, there's something we've assumed throughout this entire story, an assumption so fundamental we barely noticed it, that space was empty, waiting, unclaimed, a blank canvas, a frontier, a place where humanity could start fresh. But that assumption is wrong. The sky was never empty. Not to everyone, not to those who looked up and saw meaning, saw connection, saw the sacred. Long before rockets, long before satellites, long before treaties, the night sky belonged to someone, culturally, spiritually, in ways that laws never recognized. And now, as we fill the sky with satellites and debris, and ambitions, we're erasing something ancient, something irreplaceable. And most people don't even know what's happening. In 2007, the United Nations adopted something important, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. UNDRIP. It recognized that indigenous peoples have rights, not just on land, but to their cultures, their traditions, their ways of knowing, and crucially, it said those rights extend to places they consider sacred, even if they don't own the land, even if they've been displaced. Sacred sites, cultural landscapes, spiritual connections. On Earth, this has started to matter, started to shape law, started to protect places that colonial systems ignored. But what about beyond Earth? Some indigenous scholars are now asking that question. Could UNDRIP apply to celestial bodies, to the moon, which features in countless indigenous cosmologies, to stars that guide navigation and mark seasons, to constellations that tell stories, passed down through millennia? If the night sky is culturally significant, if it's part of indigenous heritage, if it's sacred, then does its use require consultation, permission, respect? It's a radical question, but not an unreasonable one, because for many indigenous peoples, the relationship with the night sky isn't abstract. It's not metaphorical, it's real, it's spiritual, it's essential. Stars aren't just distant suns, they're ancestors, they're guides, they're part of creation, stories that explain existence itself. The moon isn't just a rock, it's a teacher, a regulator of time, a being with its own agency. These aren't poetic ideas, they're cosmologies, worldviews, ways of understanding the universe, and humanity's place in it. And for thousands of years, those relationships were intact, protected by distance, by the impossibility of reaching the sky. But now we can reach it, we can touch it, we can change it, and in doing so, we're disrupting relationships that are older than any nation, older than any law, without asking, without consulting, without even acknowledging they exist. Consider light pollution, something most people barely think about. The glow of cities, street lights, billboards, satellites reflecting sunlight. It's washing out the stars, making the night sky dimmer, less visible, less knowable. In many cities now, you can barely see the Milky Way. The constellations are faint. The sky is nearly blank. For most people, this is inconvenient, Unfortunate but not catastrophic. But for indigenous communities, whose traditions depend on the night sky, it's cultural harm. Because if you can't see the stars, you can't navigate by them, can't teach the stories, can't perform the ceremonies, can't pass down the knowledge that has sustained your people. Light pollution erases culture, quietly, invisibly, with no compensation, no acknowledgement, and space law says nothing about it, because it doesn't recognize that the sky can be harmed. That disability is a cultural right, but maybe it should, and it's not just light pollution. It's satellites themselves, thousands of them now, tens of thousands soon. Starlink, OneWeb, others, bright streaks crossing the sky, interfering with telescopes. Astronomers have complained loudly, because satellites are ruining science, making it harder to study the universe. But indigenous communities are also affected in different ways, because the night sky is not just dated to them. It's alive, it's part of their world, part of their practice, and filling it with artificial objects changes it fundamentally. Ceremonies that require specific alignments, stories that depend on unobstructed views, navigational knowledge that assumes a natural sky, all of it is being disrupted by objects placed in orbit without their consent, without their input. It's interference, cultural interference, and it's accelerating. This brings us to an important principle, one that exists in international law, but hasn't been applied to space. If free, prior, and informed consent, it means that when a project affects indigenous peoples, when it impacts their lands, their resources, their cultures, they have the right to say no, the right to be consulted before decisions are made, before projects begin. It's not just notification. It's not just token consultation. It's genuine power. The power to withhold consent, to demand changes, to protect what matters on Earth. FPIC is growing, slowly, imperfectly, but it's recognized, it's law, it's enforceable. But in space governance, it doesn't exist. There's no mechanism, no requirement, no recognition that indigenous peoples have interests in the sky. And so satellites are launched, mining is planned, the moon is discussed as if it's empty, as if no one has a prior claim, a cultural stake, a spiritual connection. But they do, and ignoring that is not just oversight, it's erasure. The question now is whether that changes, whether indigenous voices are included, not symbolically, not as an afterthought, but genuinely, in decisions about space governance, about lunar development, about satellite constellations, about how we use the night sky. Some indigenous leaders are calling for this, demanding a seat at the table, asserting that space law cannot be written without them, because the sky is not humanity's blank slate. It's already woven into cultures, already part of worldviews, already occupied, not physically, but meaningfully, spiritually, culturally, and those meanings deserve protection just as much as property rights, just as much as commercial interests, perhaps more. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for those who assumed that space was neutral territory, open to all, free for the taking, because if the sky is culturally occupied, then development is not innocent. Mining is not simply extraction. Satellites are not just infrastructure. They're interventions into spaces that matter to people, in ways that laws never considered. And if we're serious about space belonging to all humanity, if we mean it when we say, the moon is the common heritage of mankind, then we have to ask whose humanity, whose heritage, whose commons, and we have to listen to the answers, even when they complicate our plans, even when they slow progress, even when they challenge our assumptions, because the alternative is to repeat history, to erase cultures, to take without asking, to claim emptiness where there was always meaning. Let's pause here and sit with this reframing. Space is not a blank frontier. The sky was never empty. Indigenous peoples have relationships with celestial bodies that predate nations, that predate law, that deserve recognition. Light pollution is cultural harm. Satellite interference disrupts traditions. Development on the moon affects people who've never been asked in space law. Written without indigenous voices is incomplete, unjust, inadequate. This isn't about stopping space exploration. It's not about rejecting progress. It's about doing it differently, inclusively, respectfully. It's about recognizing that the universe is not ours to claim, but ours to share with each other, and with the meanings that others have found there. Breathe and feel the weight of that, because this changes everything. If we let it, if we listen, if we're willing to see what was always there, the sky full of stars, full of stories, full of the sacred, never empty, never ours alone. And now, as we reach upward, we have a choice. to erase or to respect, to take or to honor, to ignore or to include. The treaties didn't make that choice. They didn't even see it, but we must, because the sky was never empty, and space law needs to recognize that. And so we arrive at the edge of what comes next. Because everything is about to change again, we're returning to the moon. Not for flags and footprints this time, but to stay, to build, to extract. And when we do, all the unresolved questions, all the gaps in the law, all the tensions we've ignored, they'll become urgent, unavoidable, real. We are about to rewrite everything again, and we're not ready. The return is already beginning. Multiple nations, multiple missions, racing toward the same destination: NASA's Artemis program, China's lunar base plans, India's rovers, private companies with landers and habitats, all heading to the moon within the next few years. Some within months. It's the beginning of something. Permanent presence, sustained operations, lunar infrastructure. The moon is about to become occupied in ways it never has been before. And the law is 50 years out of date. They're all going to the same place, mostly the lunar South Pole, a region of perpetual shadow and occasional sunlight, of deep craters and high peaks. It's the most valuable real estate in the solar system so far, because the South Pole has water ice trapped in permanently shaded craters, frozen for billions of years, and water is everything. Drinking water, oxygen, rocket fuel, the key to survival, the key to expansion. Whoever controls the water controls the future of lunar development. And so nations are converging on the same few craters, the same landing sites, the same resources. It's competition, quiet now, polite, coordinated barely, but as missions multiply, as bases are built, as extraction begins, that coordination might not hold. Because water ice is not just a resource, it's a strategic asset, limited in location, essential for operations, impossible to replace, and the law says it can't be owned. Says the moon belongs to no one, says appropriation is forbidden, but it doesn't say what happens when everyone wants the same crater, the same ice deposit, the same patch of sunlit ground. Some have proposed safety zones, exclusion areas around landing sites, to prevent interference, to ensure operations can continue without disruption. It sounds reasonable, practical even. You don't want one mission accidentally damaging another's equipment, creating hazards. But safety zones look a lot like territorial control. If you can exclude others from an area, if you can say this space is ours, stay away, then you've appropriated it. In function, if not in name, de facto control. Even if the law says ownership is impossible, and once one nation claims a safety zone, others will follow. Zones will expand, overlap, conflict, and the fiction that no one owns the moon will collapse. There's another concern, one that sounds softer but isn't. Environmental protection of celestial bodies. The moon has no atmosphere, no ecosystems, no life that we know of, but it has pristine conditions, ancient geology, a record of the solar system's history written in its dust. And once we start mining, building, disturbing the surface, that record is damaged, potentially lost. Some scientists argue we need environmental protections, preservation zones, limits on where development can occur, not for the moon's sake, but for science's sake, for knowledge's sake, for the understanding we might lose. But environmental law in space barely exists. The Outer Space Treaty says, celestial bodies should be used for peaceful purposes, should be explored with care, but it doesn't define care, doesn't set limits, doesn't create protections. And so the question remains, do we have a duty to preserve the moon? Or is it just another resource to be used? Different people have different answers, and no one has authority to decide. And then there's tourism, space tourism, already beginning, already profitable, private citizens paying millions to orbit Earth, to visit the ISS, soon to circle the moon. It's thrilling, historic, democratizing in a limited sense, but it's also risky, dangerous, unpredictable. And when something goes wrong, who's liable? If a tourist is injured, if a spacecraft malfunctions, if debris from a tourist mission damages someone else's satellite, who pays? The company, the nation that licensed the launch, the tourists themselves. Liability law in space was written for governments, for professional missions, for trained astronauts. It wasn't written for tourists, for amateurs, for people who signed waivers, but don't fully understand the risks. And as tourism expands, as more people go, the legal uncertainties multiply. We're building an industry on a foundation that doesn't quite fit. There's a bigger concern too, a historical one, a moral one. Colonialism, because everything we're planning, settlement, extraction, Expansion echoes something. The way colonizers treated new lands, new territories, new frontiers. They arrived, they claimed, they extracted, they built without asking, without considering who was already there, what was already valuable, and they justified it with the same language we use now.
Progress.
Development, advancement, the benefit of mankind. But colonialism didn't benefit mankind. It benefited the powerful, it displaced the vulnerable, it created inequalities that still persist, and now we're doing it again, in space, with better technology, with legal frameworks, with international cooperation of a sort. But the pattern is similar. The powerful arrive first, claim the best resources, set the rules, distribute the benefits to themselves, and everyone else watches from below. Some scholars are calling this off-world colonialism, and they're asking, how do we prevent it? How do we make sure that space development doesn't repeat the injustices of the past, doesn't concentrate power, doesn't exclude those who can't afford a rocket? The answer is unclear, but the question is urgent. And yet there's also hope, a strange hope, that space law might teach us something, might become a laboratory for solving problems we haven't solved on Earth. Because space is a global commons, a place that belongs to no one, that requires cooperation, that punishes unilateral action. It's a testing ground for governance, models we've never tried, for rules that transcend nations, for coordination at a scale we've rarely achieved. If we can create fair systems for space, if we can manage resources equitably, if we can enforce rules without a central authority, then maybe we can apply those lessons to Earth, to oceans, to the atmosphere, to climate, to all the other commons we've struggled to protect. Space law could be a model, a proof of concept, a way forward, or it could be another failure, another example of human short-sightedness, another missed opportunity. The outcome depends on what we do next. Right now, we're in a critical moment, a moment where state practice is hardening into custom, because international law doesn't just come from treaties. It also comes from what nations actually do repeatedly, consistently, with the belief that they're following a rule, and in space nations are acting, launching, building, extracting, creating precedents, and those precedents are becoming norms, unwritten rules, expectations about what's allowed. If enough nations mine asteroids without objection, then mining becomes permitted, customary law. If enough nations establish safety zones, and others accept them, then safety zones become standard. This is happening now quietly, without formal agreements, just through practice. And it means that the next few years will shape space law for decades, for centuries. What we do now, what we allow, what we challenge, all of it matters. All of it becomes the foundation.
But we need new models.
New governance structures, new ways of making decisions, because the old system, the treaty system, is too slow, too rigid, too dependent on consensus. Space is moving too fast. Technology is advancing too quickly. Commercial actors are too numerous. We can't wait for 50 nations to agree on a treaty. Can't negotiate for decades. Can't freeze development while we debate. We need something else, something adaptive, something that can evolve with the challenges. Some propose international agencies with real authority, real enforcement power, real ability to make decisions. Others propose industry self-regulation standards, created by companies, enforced by markets, by reputation. Still others propose multi-stakeholder models, where governments, companies, scientists, indigenous peoples, civil society, all have a voice, all share power. No one knows which model will work, or if any of them will, but the old model is insufficient, and everyone can see it. And so we're left with questions, hard questions, questions without easy answers. Who decides who benefits when lunar water is extracted? When asteroid metals are sold? When orbital slots are allocated? Who decides which nations get access? Which companies get licenses? Which communities are consulted? Is it the powerful, the wealthy, the first to arrive? Or is it everyone? Somehow, collectively? The law doesn't say, and the practice is creating inequality. Who enforces the rules? When safety zones overlap? When debris isn't removed? When resources are over-extracted? When someone acts in bad faith? Who intervenes? Who punishes? Who corrects? There's no police, no court with jurisdiction, no mechanism for enforcement, only diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, reputation, soft power, insufficient power, no power, and the stakes increase as conflicts arise. That absence will matter. Who speaks for humanity? The treaties say space belongs to all mankind. that the moon is the common heritage, that benefits should be shared. Beautiful words, noble words. But who decides what that means? Who represents all mankind? Who ensures that heritage is protected, that benefits are shared? Is it the UN? But the UN reflects national power, gives veto power to a few, moves only when consensus allows. Is it scientists? But scientists don't represent everyone, don't speak for the excluded, for the vulnerable, for those without telescopes. Is it corporations? Certainly not. Is it anyone? Or is the phrase just rhetoric? Beautiful language that means nothing, that justifies anything. These are the questions we must answer soon. And so we end here not with answers, but with reflection. Space law began with hope, with the dream that space could be different, that humanity could cooperate, that the cosmos could bring out our best. And in some ways it worked. Treaties were signed, wars were avoided, space remained mostly peaceful, but in other ways it failed, or never tried. Gaps remained, inequalities persisted, hard questions were left unasked, and now we're returning to the moon, heading to Mars, building industries in orbit, and the law must evolve, must adapt, must become something it never was: fair, enforceable, inclusive, adaptive. It's possible, it's necessary, but it's not guaranteed. Because law is just words, unless people choose to follow it, to enforce it, to make it real. And people don't always choose justice, don't always choose fairness, don't always choose the harder right. But we can write better rules, include more voices, create systems that work, that protect, that share. We can learn from the past, from the treaties that succeeded, from the gaps that remain, from the voices that were never heard. We can make space what we always said it was: the province of all mankind, a common heritage, a place for everyone. Or we can fail again and carry our worst instincts to the stars. The choice is being made now, through practice, through precedent, through what we allow and what we challenge, through who we include and who we leave behind. Let's rest here at the edge of what comes next, with questions, with possibilities, with uncertainty, because this is where we are. This is the moment. This is our chance to create something better, or to repeat something old, to build law that serves humanity, all of it, or to build law that serves power. We are about to rewrite everything again, and what we write will echo through the cosmos. For as long as we're out there, breathe and let that settle. The weight of it, the possibility of it, the responsibility of it, because the future of space law isn't written yet, and we, all of us, are the ones holding the pen.